All right, welcome to the first video format workshop log where I document the development of my figures and miniatures for 3D printing, as well as other projects that come up. In the previous written workshop logs, I went over the development of these D-Day Rangers, specifically made to represent Rangers as they were in the early moments of the Normandy landings. This week, we are looking at the first stages of development for the sniper teams. Now, the goal of these sniper teams is to have two sets, one for the early D-Day Rangers wearing the assault vest, like the one here in the sitting pose, and a second one with standard US webbing, like for example, this figure here. Now, I have not yet test printed this particular sculpt, so that's going to happen next week. But today I thought we would take a look at the design decisions behind this sniper rifle. Now, the rifle in question is this M1903 bolt action rifle. Now, this one here is the A1 variant from the early 1900s. Up until the Second World War, this was the standard issue US infantry rifle. During the Second World War, the M1 Garand replaced this rifle. However, the rifle didn't go completely away. The M1903A4 variant depicted here became the standard sniper rifle for the US forces. Now, if we take a look at this rifle here, here is the 28mm version of this A4 variant. Now, for 28mm weapons, what we are dealing with is striking a balance between the design of the weapon itself and printability, as well as having the weapon be paintable and representative of what the actual object is. Immediately we can see a few differences here. Obviously mine is a lot thicker. The proportions are fairly different. This is due to the fact that we have to fit this entire thing into a smaller space. I guess that's the best way to put it. Aside from making the weapon a little bit bulkier in general, you have to think about what sort of things make up the visual read and the visual design language of this actual weapon. Now, immediately we can see a few key aspects of this weapon. If we take a look at the barrel line here, it's obviously a straight line here, but the weapon itself has this concave shape, this negative space above it. And that is one of the key features I tried to capture for the miniature version. I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be enough of a concave. Maybe I should exaggerate that a little bit to get the overall feel of the weapon right. But we'll see once the weapon is test printed. Now, this sort of design language is what makes the weapon itself feel as a tiny miniature version of the real thing. And of course, in terms of proportions, you can pretty clearly see that this front part of the rifle is shortened. This is to make the entire thing more compact, because obviously at this scale, this would be pretty long and it would become too thin for printing and for painting and all that sort of thing. So it's being compacted a little bit. And this front part is one of the key differences here. This is where I chose to make it a little bit shorter, as well as this part here where the hand would go. So that's a great place to sort of hide a very key feature like this shape here and this shape. I made this a little bit shorter here. The hand is going to be there, so it's probably not going to be too visible unless the rifle is shouldered. But for those figures, I can just simply do a custom sculpt where this would match this a little bit better. Obviously, some of the key features here, like the end of the bolt here and the whatever this is called, the bolt handle, are quite a lot bigger than in the actual rifle. And this scope here, I actually have no idea what this particular scope is. However, I did research that during this period, US infantry and the US Rangers armed with this rifle would have likely had the M37 or M37B viewer scope, which was a 2.5 time magnification scope. And here, with this diagram here, we can see that this is roughly, the scope roughly ends, you know, right around here. And I tried to match that pretty closely, while keeping the proportions of the scope itself sort of recognizable. You know, you have to move things around quite a bit when miniaturizing something like this. It's almost as if you're working on a caricature of something, but obviously the amount of exaggeration and the amount of things you move around becomes a style decision, right? As long as the weapon reads and looks like the actual version, then you know you're good. And here's a couple of interesting frames from Saving Private Ryan. Now, Private Jackson here has the 1903A4 with the M37 scope. I believe later in the film the scope changes to something else. I was looking at the frames and they didn't have the M37 throughout the entire film. Might be mistaken, but I'm not sure it's going to be that one. But anyway, here we have the visible scope here. It's a very visible feature, so I wanted to keep that thing big, right? Because we're working with this small 28mm figure, so I want this to be one of the key features that your eye gets drawn into when it's viewed. And you can see here, like, this is how big the scope is compared to the rest of the figure. You know, it's a very clear feature. You can clearly see it's a sniper rifle. And here I particularly chose this frame because it shows Private Jackson walking here with the rifle here, and you can see the sort of overall shape of the weapon. It's this taper, and that taper comes from the fact that this whole assembly here is fairly thick, and then it tapers down from this concave shape into this thinner shape, right? And that's the feeling, that's the overall look that I want the rifle to have. But I can't obviously have this entire thing be in actual scale and have the actual like exact taper, because then my 3D print would be, well, it would be too thin and, you know, completely useless for wargaming and all those kind of applications. Now, these are gaming figures after all. So I'm using references like this to study how the shape language of whatever it is that I'm working on affects the overall read on the of the object, right? So I'm trying to match that taper here. I'm not sure yet if this is enough, or do I need to exaggerate it a little bit more so that when viewed from a distance, when viewed on the table, for example, we would have this clear taper happen here. And conversely, compared to the M1 Garand, the taper on that one is much less, right? So my Garand is pretty thick and pretty stocky, just like the rest of the weapons at this scale. And taper isn't that big of a feature, right? So I made sure that this rifle is thick enough to be printed, and you can see here that there's not much of a taper. There's a tiny bit taper here from this concave line here, but the top line is pretty straight. That's completely different from the 1903, and that's the distinction that I need to be wary of. I don't want this thing to look like, you know, just any rifle with a scope on it. You know, I can't throw a scope on a Garand and say that this is a sniper rifle. This is a much sleeker design than the Garand is. And next week, when I test print these, we'll see if I've actually achieved what I'm looking for here. Now, for the overall look, I'm fairly happy that most of the features that you would see in this rifle are now represented in this 28mm version as well. The distance between these two sort of cutouts compared to the real one may be too close. We'll see. The important thing is that they're there, right? And as I mentioned previously, you know, this is a miniaturized, sort of a caricature version of the actual thing, and definitely not a scale accurate model, because, you know, it can't be. Like this would be much too long and much too thin to be able to be used at 28mm. All right, I think that's it for this week's workshop log. That's what's been happening here in the workshop. I try to do these weekly if I can. And if you're interested in the development of these figures, either the STLs or the upcoming physical releases, follow me on Instagram, subscribe on YouTube, join the newsletter, and all that great stuff for updates. And definitely stay in touch. I get a lot of questions and I get into a lot of different interesting conversations about the wargaming space in general and these figures in DMs or email. And I really love that. I really love the fact that there's so many of you guys who are so interested in what I do here. And so thank you for that. I do this almost full time, and that's entirely because of you guys and those who support this project. And so thank you. And I think this sort of format, these sort of weekly workshop logs, are a great way to answer some questions that people have and keep you guys updated on what's happening here. And definitely keep those questions coming, because I'm going to definitely try to answer them in these videos, or maybe I'll do a sculpting stream or a painting stream for these figures at some point. We'll see. And if you're using these figures, let me know. I love to hear and see what you guys are doing with these figures. Yeah, I guess that's about it for this week. I'll see you next time.